Leah had always known, in some way, that the hardware store was the gravitational center of her life. That small store on a quiet street in her town, with its shelves filled with tools, nails, paint, and metal parts, seemed to be the whole world to her when she was a child. She remembered the warm summer afternoons when, after school, she would run there, eager to hide between the aisles and mimic the gestures of her father, who, with calloused hands, would rearrange the shelves and organize the stock. The store always had something magical about it, like a sanctuary where nothing seemed to threaten the peace. Her father, a discreet and infallible man, was the pillar of that small empire, someone who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders without showing signs of fatigue. To Leah, the store was more than just a place of work. It was the symbol of stability, of a life that had always been calm, without great surprises. The smell of metal, the sound of tools clashing together, and the warm, stuffy air of the environment were part of her identity, of a routine she believed to be eternal. But no one could foresee that that familiar space, which always gave her the feeling of security, would one day become the origin of her greatest pains and challenges. Her father's death happened unexpectedly, almost abruptly. Leah wasn't prepared to deal with it. She could still feel the warmth of his calloused hands, and she found herself trying to recall his voice, always gentle, giving her advice on how to keep the store running. That day, after the news of his death, she felt paralyzed. There was no time to say goodbye, to talk to him about what she should do. It was just an overwhelming and sudden loss. The funeral was small, just as he had wanted, with only a few people and no grand ceremonies. It was everything he wished for. Something discreet, simple, without drama. But after the last words were said and the crowd dispersed, something much heavier settled into Leah's life. The emptiness of the loss mixed with the responsibility of a future she wasn't ready to face. Leah was forced to take control of the store. There was no choice anymore. Her father, always so careful with everyone around him, had never prepared her for the challenges of managing the business. There had been no talks about numbers or debts. She knew enough to manage the shelves and serve the customers, but the financial aspect of the store had always been in her father's hands. It was never her concern until that moment. The store had been the symbol of her family, the guarantee of a secure future. But now, all she found were landmines of financial commitments she didn't know how to handle. The first step, naturally, was to examine the finances. Leah was terrified, but she knew she had to do it. She couldn't hide behind her father anymore. With trembling hands, she went to his office, the place that had always been her fortress, and started opening drawers and folders. Inside, she found a pile of papers, unpaid checks, and overdue invoices. As she scanned the documents, Leah felt the weight of the debts and her father's ignorance of the reality he had hidden. The numbers danced before her eyes, each one higher than the last, like an impossible mountain to climb. The store didn't have enough money to survive more than a month, and the feeling of sinking began to spread through her body. In panic, she rummaged through more and more papers, trying to understand how this had happened. The supplier contracts were outdated, the bills overdue. Leah tried to call the bank, talk to some creditors, but with each attempt, the weight of the problem only increased. And as if all this wasn't enough, she felt that the store was no longer the same. The environment, once cozy and filled with familiarity, now seemed suffocating. The tools, covered in dust and rusted, no longer reflected her father's energy, who had always prided himself on keeping them in perfect condition. The smell of metal, once a symbol of strength and stability, now felt like a reminder of something broken, of something that couldn't be fixed anymore. The days began to drag on. The phone, which used to ring constantly with customers, now only drew the attention of debt collectors. The afternoons passed slowly, and Leah could hardly find the strength to open the doors and serve the few customers who still showed up. The market was in crisis, and no one cared about the store anymore. Every corner of that store, every empty shelf, seemed to scream about the dire state of things. The glorious past of her family seemed like an illusion, something distant and unreachable. Every time Leah passed through the store's door, she felt a growing weight on her shoulders. The place that had always been a symbol of security was now a prison. It was then, on a particularly difficult morning, that Elias walked into the store. Elias had always been her father's right hand. He had worked there for more than 20 years with unwavering loyalty and was considered by everyone in town as part of the family. Leah, as a child, saw him as an uncle, a sturdy man with an easy smile, always willing to tell stories and help with whatever was needed. But that day, Elias seemed different. His smile was gone, and his eyes, normally bright, were dull, as if they carried an unbearable weight. He walked into the store with slow, hesitant steps, as if preparing himself to face something much bigger. "Leah," he said in a deep voice, "we need to talk. I'm entitled to a part of the business." She stopped, surprised. Elias? A part of the business? She had never heard of this. She had never imagined that he had any involvement beyond being a mere employee. Leah frowned, trying to understand what he was talking about. "What are you talking about, Elias?" she asked, her voice trembling, trying to keep control over the situation. Elias looked around, as if gathering courage to say something he knew would change. "Everything. Your father promised me a part of the store." It was a promise, informal, but he told me that when he retired, a part would be mine. Leah remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her father, the man who had always been so reserved and silent about his own problems, had made a promise to Elias, something she had never known about. She looked at him with wide eyes, trying to process those words. "Why didn't he ever tell me about this?" she whispered, more to herself than to Elias. Elias took a deep breath, as if the question he was preparing to answer was even more difficult than the previous revelation. "Your father was trying to handle everything. The debts, the loans. He had so much on his shoulders that he couldn't share with you. He always wanted the store to be yours, that you would have the best, but he couldn't handle it all. He asked me to take on a part, a promise between the two of us, because he knew he couldn't do it alone." Elias' words sounded like a sharp blade to Leah's chest. Her father, that capable man, was fighting against an invisible enemy, the weight of his own unkept promises. He had made choices to try to protect the family, but what he didn't know was that, in the end, this would become a burden too heavy for Leah to carry. The debts were there, in yellowed papers, but now there was also the silent betrayal of a promise she had never known about. Little by little, Leah began to feel the pain of the discovery. Her father, that capable man, hadn't been transparent with her, and the weight of all this began to crush her soul. It wasn't just the mourning of her father, but the feeling of being dragged into an abyss of financial and emotional turmoil. Elias, now, seemed to be the only person she could trust, but even he had his own rights, his own demands. She didn't know what to do anymore. In the days that followed, the stress only grew. The debts mounted, the creditors were relentless, and the phone never stopped ringing. Elias stayed at the store, waiting for the resolution of a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The sleepless nights became long and agonizing. Every time Leah tried to concentrate, her mind dragged her into the abyss of uncertainty. She didn't know how to rebuild the store, how to honor her father's promises, or even how to deal with what life was now demanding from her. She was on the verge of collapse. Finally, the breaking point came. The bank threatened to take the store. The debts were out of control. The store, which had always been a symbol of stability, was about to be lost forever. Leah found herself faced with a difficult choice, an impossible decision to make. Should she sell the store and pay the debts, or risk everything to try to save something that was already broken? She sat, exhausted, in one of the chairs in the store. The sound of the phone ringing seemed to grow more distant. She looked at the walls, the empty shelves, and a feeling of defeat overcame her being. But in the midst of the pain, something within her shifted. She knew she couldn't keep going like this, fighting against something that was already dead. With a deep sigh, Leah made the decision that would change her life. She would sell the store, not just to pay the debts, but to finally close that chapter of her life. She couldn't keep trying to save something that had never really been hers. She needed to free herself from it and start over. The sale was difficult, and each signature on the papers seemed to tear a piece of her heart away. But as she walked out of the store for the last time, with her eyes misty, Leah realized that this was her chance to break free. She no longer needed to carry the weight of her father's legacy. Not anymore. She wouldn't have to bear the burden of unkept promises. She was finally ready to walk her own path. And as she walked away from the store for the last time, Leah felt a strange peace fill her being. She knew that, by leaving the store behind, she was giving herself a chance to build something new, something that was entirely hers. She was no longer the daughter of the man who tried. She was now a woman who finally had control over her own destiny.